In this episode, you'll hear why hope is actually a science, something that you can cultivate, and not just a feeling, and why that distinction might be the thing that finally helps you move forward. Let's just start right here, right? So the definition of hope that we work with is the belief that the future will be better than the present, combined with the belief that we have some power to make it so. Is that right? Is that the way that we would define hope?
Yeah, that's the starting point in terms of that we think about the future, that the goals we have, and hope as conceptualized by Snyder is about that trait-like belief that you can have those goals and you can work up strategies or pathways to pursue them, and you have the agency or the motivation to kind of keep that perseverance in pursuing those goals. And so that you're trying to make the future that you want to happen.
So describe those two pathways. He talks about willpower and way power. What are those things?
Yeah, so wave power is the idea. It's also called pathways thinking that
Mm-hmm.
in addition to having the goals that I want to get this job, I want to get married, whatever kind of is meaningful and valuable in one's life, when you have those goals, you also have to figure out how to pursue and achieve those goals. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
how do you connect the dots? How do you get from A to B? And that's the pathways thinking is do you have that belief, that ability to generate those strategies to pursue those goals? And if you encounter setbacks, if there's difficulties or obstacles, can you come up with new alternative plans to keep pursuing them so it's not, okay, the first setback, I give up my goal. And so we know people who are higher in hope have that ability to keep persevering and coming up with pathways or strategies to pursue the goals. So that's pathways or the way power. And the willpower is the more motivational component, that energy, that persistence, that determination that you've identified your goals, you've identified the strategies of how you want to pursue them. And do you have that energy and motivation to really stay motivated and energized in the pursuit of those goals to try and achieve whatever it is that you're looking for? And so those two forces combine, and we found across decades of research now that they can be important predictors of success across many different life domains.
Yeah, it's beautiful just to think about like these two levers. I mean, because so
Mm-hmm.
often I think people conceptualize hope maybe as just optimism and this notion of like, I feel like things can be better. Okay, but that desire, that motivation is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, well, how am I actually going to get there? And what am I going to do? And that's that pathways thinking that you're speaking about is like, okay, I can have the motivation to do whatever, start a podcast, write a book, pursue an advanced degree, um, go on a date, those type of things. You can have the desire for that, but then often we can get frustrated or overwhelmed by the process. And so breaking things down and having those pathways, looking at taking things small and saying, okay, like how do I actually get to where I need to get to? Now, some of that, of course, is we don't fully know. I mean, once you actually start the journey is when things might reveal itself. But at least beginning that process of starting the pathways, thinking about, okay, how do I actually achieve the thing that I want to go after? Now, inherent in all of this, as we're just speaking, and I think this will probably shock people, is that inherent to hope is the notion of risk, right? I mean, this notion that like I'm going to try to pursue something that I think is worth pursuing. Um, it means that I may not necessarily achieve it. So there's an element of risk or obstacles that we're going to anticipate as part of this equation of hope. Is that right?
Absolutely. And that uncertainty is something that anytime you're pursuing a goal for the future, you're trying to make something happen, it might not be guaranteed. And uncertainty can be a huge driver of anxiety. And so
Mhm.
that's what something that can be an obstacle for people is that it's a really big deal to achieve this job promotion, to achieve this relationship, whatever it may be. And you might understandably be stressed or feel a little anxious about that. And that's part of what we found is that hope is helpful in terms of people, it's not that they deny those feelings, that they can be aware of that, but they recognize like these goals are valuable and they need to persevere in the face of that. And so it's not about you're magically getting rid of any of these kinds of feelings. It's you're persevering and you're actively pursuing these things. And so you mentioned the difference between hope and optimism. That is something that there's a lot of empirical work studying that hope is more of an active pursuit of the goals. Optimism, at
Mm.
least how we study in psychology, is you believe things are going to be good in the future, or they might get better, but it's not as clear the how or why. And so
Hmm.
you might just think, I'm really lucky. I'm going to win the lottery. I'm going to get some good breaks. And that's also important. It's not that optimism isn't helpful, but that hope is not a passive pursuit of the goals. It's an active pursuit of the goals. And it is trying to overcome that uncertainty and the anxiety that can come with it as you do that.
That sense of passivity, I always like to joke like, okay, so we're here at the start of football season. All right. Are you a football fan at all, Matt? Just ask.
Yep.
All right. Who's your team?
Texans.
Texans. All right. You're in Houston. So on brand. All right. Go
Yes.
CJ Stroud. All right. Let's make it happen.
Didn't start so
Um,
well for us yesterday, but we got a chance still.
well, so here's the conversation, right? I mean, like, how many of us, when we start the season, all the fans are like, our team's going to win the championship. We're going to the Super Bowl. Like, we're going to crush the division. We're doing it, right? Everybody goes into see. Well, not everybody. I mean, I live in Charlotte, so no offense to the Panthers fans, but
Yes.
like, it's we'll just go with that. Anyways,
Exceptions.
exceptions are exceptions, but most fan bases go into a season with a degree of optimism,
Hmm.
which isn't the same thing as hope. Optimism is this passive sense. Now, I don't work for the Carolina Panthers. I don't think you work for the Texans. Maybe you do.
Nope.
I don't think so. And so any sort of actual effect that you and I as casual fans can have on our team is none, right? Minimal,
Yeah.
none. And so that hope that we feel going into a season is nothing more than optimism. And because there's no actual pathways thinking, is that right? There's no actual way that I can affect any sort of change onto my franchise, right?
Yeah, our football team's succeeding or failing has nothing to do with our individual agency. It's not within our control. And
That's right.
so we can have the positive expectations or negative expectations depending on kind of how we view our team, but it is more in that category of an external locus of control, something
Mhm.
that other people are determining whether or not it works or not. And so it might still be helpful to be optimistic so you're not as stressed on a Sunday
Right.
afternoon watching your team. But as much as we might be superstitious as sports fans, we
Yeah.
don't actually control how those games turn out.
Yeah. Or if you're a Florida State fan, for example, hypothetically speaking, if you're a Florida State fan, last year when we went 2-10, I just let go of Saturdays. It was like, oh, I don't even have to worry about Saturdays anymore because I know what the outcome's going to be. We're just going
Yeah,
to stink this year. So I was able to have more time with my children, which is a bad statement, but the truth.
it's
So
good to be realistic sometimes
it's
too.
good to be realistic sometimes too. So we know where we're actually putting our efforts and our energy. So hope connected, all right, is this. Well, just to say this, because optimism is really, I mean, I know there's ways that we can increase optimism, but there's an element of optimism that is genetic, right? I mean, there's just some people who are just happier than others. Is that correct?
There does seem to be some heritability component for optimism. It is also like hope, a stable kind of personality trait or dimension. It's not something where you're kind of born to be optimistic or
Hmm.
not. I think
Okay.
it's something that is very malleable. It's something that we can intervene upon. And just like with hope, that both these things, as people become aware of them, they can make active efforts to increase them and to kind of bolster them and reinforce them. And
Hmm.
so, some people it might come a little bit easier to, but they are also skills, and a lot of the skills involved with being more hopeful, optimistic. They're also consistent with some of the things we do in cognitive behavioral therapies for
Hmm.
anxiety, depression, PTSD, common disorders. And so these are skills that can be reinforced.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into some of the practicalities then. All right. Example you gave earlier about somebody pursuing a job and wanting to pursue a career or something of that nature, right? Let's say that person has a desire to make a shift, or if they're a college student graduating, they're trying to set up their career, taking the next step. Um, but they are riddled with some of that uncertainty that you spoke about.
Mhm.
They're riddled with some of that anxiety about how do I get the job interview? Is my resume sufficient enough? How does hope in an active sense, right? You just want to reiterate this for the listeners that what we're speaking about this, and this is the biggest misconception about hope, is that people often think of hope in a passive context, like we've been saying about hope that my team wins the Super Bowl, hope that the vending machine has the soda that I want, hope that whatever. But we always talk about hope in a passive context in kind of our culture. And what we're trying to do here is and what you're doing with your research and what I think what Snyder's work is really saying is that hope is something active. And so we just want to reclaim that to people, really lock that in so people understand that what we're speaking about is hope in an active sense. So if somebody is uncertain about the future, somebody is uncertain about a job transition, or what are ways that they can increase their hope in the midst of that uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think in terms of the example of pursuing a job,
Hmm.
one of the things we found with people studying people who are higher in hope is it's not just that they have more intense or more aspirational goals, they're also better at kind of calibrating and breaking down their goals so it can become less overwhelming. And so it's not that, well, my goal for my job is I want to become CEO, that
Hmm.
that's the one goal and there's nothing in between that.
Hmm.
It's I want to work in this area, so let's break that down. The first step is this is the terminal degree or the training that I need. These are the experiences. Okay, this is what I have so far. How do I connect those dots? And so trying to take these grand, big goals that by themselves might seem overwhelming, if you break that down into some of the steps, it might be easier to think about. Okay, well, if the first step is I need to get a couple summer internships, this is how I can use my current resources as my school to help identify some opportunities where that helps to make it seem less overwhelming. And so that helps to mitigate some of that uncertainty, helps to maintain some of that motivation where rather than it being this grand, overwhelming goal that's kind of too abstract to
Hmm.
effectively even
That's right.
pursue, it's you start thinking about, okay, this is the big picture long term, but there might be 74 steps along the way. How do I start pursuing those more concretely individually? And that also allows us to frame more short-term tasks in terms of their stretch goals where they might be challenging, but you're not going from, okay, I want to learn to throw a football to I'm going to be in the NFL next week kind of thing,
Right.
where it's not going such extremes, where it's keeping it manageable and feasible in terms of what you're pursuing. And
Yeah.
so that's what we found. We study high hope people that they're better able to generate those pathways, but in doing so, they have an effective strategy for identifying what are the sub goals. And they're also able to effectively use resources and identify support from other people. And so a lot of hope is talking about, the individual, but it can also involve like pursuing social support,
Hmm.
family, friends, loved ones, whoever it may be. So it's not just pursuing goals on your own.
That's beautiful, because that also just speaks about a question of focus, gratitude for each step, really looking at the process, not just focusing on the outcome, allowing adventure to be part of this equation, risk to be part of the equation, like we said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That if you can break down those strategies, and then also reiteration along the way, that you could start on that pathway and hit some bumps in the road or hit some failures, and give yourself permission to pivot as you need to. Um, but also just being grateful for every step as you take it. I read many years ago Chris Hadfield's autobiography, and who's an astronaut. We're speaking about Houston, and he is a Canadian astronaut, flew many missions for NASA also. And the book, what's the book called? The book's called An Astronaut's Guide to Everyday Life. And along the way, he speaks about exactly this, where he said he had the goal to be an astronaut, but he knew that that was a lofty goal, and that there was only, I don't know, a handful of people that get admitted into an astronaut class every single year out of the 10 or 20,000 applicants that come in. So he knew it was a slim chance, it was a lofty goal, but he set up his career to make it happen. But he knew that even if he didn't get to the goal of being an astronaut, that he would be happy, whether it was in the Air Force or when he became a test pilot. That he knew that every step along the way, he was satisfied with the goal that he had achieved, always looking at the next one to maybe try to push it. But even if he didn't get to the next level, that he'd be satisfied and happy with the level that he was at. I think that's somebody we would claim to be a high hope individual, where you can look at that and say, all right, I'm striving for something, but I need to find a certain degree of satisfaction with where I'm at, so that I'm not completely obsessed with this goal, that it's driving, we're moving, there's the motivation that's there, but I'm also trying to be present in the here and now, trying to be grateful for the journey as it's unfolding before me, giving myself a little bit of permission to just have that focus, and be okay with where things are, even if that goal that I'm pursuing doesn't come to fruition.
Yeah, and that's where we're trying to figure out that that might be the grand goal, but on the way, if he has to, be an Air Force captain and do these
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things that are important, those are steps along that journey. And those are important things that it seems much more feasible to get that last step of becoming an astronaut if you've already achieved being in the Air Force, getting those accomplishments. And so that's part of what we found is that it's getting that momentum, that motivation, you're pursuing your goals and things are going well, and it keeps having that progress that can be helpful.
So again, recapping this, if somebody's facing some uncertainty in their life, the best bit of advice here is what? To make it a little bit smaller? Is that what you would say? Kind of refocus on what the goal is, like put yourself what's in front of you and try to be attentive to that.
Yeah, it can involve just reflecting on what are the most important parts of this goal. And so, if it's reflecting on meaning and values, to think about, okay, I've been pursuing this. Which aspects of this do I derive the most pleasure and meaning from? Which do I want to keep pursuing and prioritizing? And break that down to make it more concrete and think about, we can all get kind of stuck in routines. Like, is what I'm pursuing actually what I want to pursue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great questions to be reflecting on, as you're kind of going along the way. Again, love, just want to reiterate this, love the notion that hope is active. It tracks even from like a virtue ethics perspective, where in the Catholic tradition we would speak about hope as being a virtue, this firm disposition towards what's good, and or this habituated good, this notion that like there's something I can do here to make myself be better. And so I guess in all virtues are kind of in the middle of the road, right? I mean, one would say maybe too much hope or false hope would be sort of a naivete. But then too little hope on the other extreme would be a cynicism where nothing's going to work out. And so
Mm-hmm.
there needs to be a balance between both of those. You can't live in a naive, blind optimism like we've been speaking about, but you also can't live with this darkened, cynical attitude either. There has to be this sort of middle ground where you say, yeah, I'm pursuing something. I'm choosing to pursue something that's good, but recognizing that it may or may not work out, but I have to try. I have to try. So how do you see, okay, kind of the overlap here between psychological theories of hope and these classical virtue ethics? Like where do you think that they may overlap? Where do you think they diverge?
It's a good question, and it is a tricky issue in terms of even within psychology, there's a number of different conceptualizations of hope. And so the Snyder model is the one that has the most empirical support. There's been the most studies kind of evaluating it, but it's definitely not the only model. And so Snyder's model focuses on hope as this cognitive resource, this resilience trait, as we've been discussing. Other models place hope as more of an emotional experience, more along the kind of more colloquial ways that people talk about, like, I hope
Mm-hmm.
things work out. I hope for
Mm-hmm.
the best, those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things. And there's also more faith-based
Mm-hmm.
traditions about hope might be conceptualized. And I think that's one of the things that's made people curious about hope for so many years, is it's something that people talk about, but it's been hard to really
Mm-hmm.
nail down. And so I think the core idea about it involves some expectation for the future and a belief that you can make that happen. Snyder's model incorporates, emotions within it in terms of that's our feedback mechanism as we pursue our goals. But for the pursuit of those goals, it's much more of a cognitively oriented trait and
Mm-hmm.
theory. And so that's what my team and many of my colleagues have been studying, but it's definitely not the only
Got it.
model.
Got it. All right. Well, I mean, you brought it up in terms of just the emotions element. How do you feel in terms of Barbara Fredrickson's work with the positive emotions and looking at hope as one of the 10 positive emotions? How does Snyder's model relate to a theory like that?
Yeah, so Barbara Fredrickson's done a lot of really interesting work about the role of positive emotions and her broad
Mm-hmm.
and build theory about how when we're experiencing positive emotions, that expands our cognitive capacities, that we can be more creative, we can be more open, we can be more positive as we pursue new tasks. And so I think it's complementary with Snyder's model, but in some of the work that she and others have done of thinking that is hope one of those emotions, that is a different kind of conceptualization or
Mm-hmm.
approach than what we study of hope as a trait and a cognitive kind of trait. And so it's an alternative conceptualization. I think when you break down to what is that emotion of hope, and so that gets a little bit tricky in terms of exactly how do we parse the different positive emotions, and is it a positively valence experience towards the future? How we think about that, that is where some of these theories are still being
Mm.
refined, and some of us, we need more empirical work to show what's the best way to conceptualize it. Um, but that is an alternative approach, and other theories emphasize different components about, is there more of a spiritual
Mm-hmm.
dimension? Is there more of a, cultural dimension? Snyder's hope theory is, in many ways, a very American theory about what I, as an individual, can
Sure.
conceptualize as my goals and how I can pursue those. And so it's not all encompassing by any
Mm.
means. And it's something that we have a lot of work showing that that model, it's an important resilience trait that we can reliably measure, we can reliably target interventions, and it can robustly predict many outcomes. But it's not the only thing that you need. It's also important to have
Mm-hmm.
gratitude, to be curious, to be
Mm-hmm.
optimistic. And so there's some situations that, depending on what you're going through, optimism might be more relevant
Mm.
even than hope. And so it's finding the balance in all of these different resilience traits rather than falling into the trap of like, well, this is the one that solves
Mm-hmm.
everything. So we think hope is really important, but it's not the only
Yeah.
factor.
And even Snyder's interpretation of it and the work that you do isn't the only way of looking at it, like you're saying, and you're giving space
Yeah.
for other conceptualizations of hope and recognizing that it's something that it's kind of like love, right? I mean, like we could talk about love in a lot of different contexts of an emotion, or is it a decision that we make? It's almost similar in that regard, where it can be a little hard to nail down what exactly it is that we're speaking about, but we do know we're speaking about something that does exist. We know that we're speaking about this trait, this notion of hope, that is there, and that we all experience it. Um,
Yeah, and ultimately it comes down to what does the empirical
mm,
data show, and that's as we study it and different models and measures, and what is found to have the most validity, what works the best, what does the data support, and theories within psychology and other areas of science
yeah,
get refined over time. And so as we improve our understanding, so Snyder's model has helped to guide research for nearly 40
well,
years. But it's not like any theory, it's not perfect and it could be improved and
right.
refined. So but it's important to recognize kind of what we have learned and the extent of the knowledge we can gain from that. And then how do we keep moving forward where it's really based off that empirical data and what the science is telling us.
Well, what's the role of patience in hope?
That's an interesting question. I think patience would be as you're pursuing your goal of how do you approach that in terms of the time perspective or the urgency. And so hope is very much a future oriented
Mm-hmm.
construct. You're thinking about your goals for the future, but how you connect those dots, just because you're hopeful doesn't mean that you have to be crazy urgent about everything that you're
Mm-hmm.
pursuing. And some of it might be of understanding of, there's a time and a place of when you want to pursue goals. And so if you're trying to achieve that educational goal, that might be important. But if you're at dinner with your family, that's not the time to bring out your textbook to do these
Right,
kinds of
right.
things. And so finding that balance, I think we do find that people that are higher in hope have a better ability to appraise like what's an appropriate situation for how to pursue those goals. And so not to go about it in a maniacal way, but to have an appropriate fit for them circumstances, which would involve some
Mm-hmm.
degree of patience, and that there's a prudence and a kind of appropriate judgment about the time and place for best pursuing individual
Yeah.
pathways.
Waiting is part of it. So I think in Spanish, my family were from Nicaragua, and so Spanish, I grew up speaking both languages. And the word for hope in Spanish is esperanza. The word for waiting
Mm-hmm.
is esperar. It's the same word. And so
Esperar.
it's
Yeah.
literally the same word, that's used in both contexts. That is so inherent to the notion of hope is this notion that sometimes we do have to wait. So an example that I can
Mm-hmm.
give in my life is I ran cross country in high school, and one of the goals that I had from a young age was I wanted to run a marathon. I went to college. I knew I'd heard somewhere along the way that it wasn't good to run a marathon while you're too young. You really wanted to wait till your body kind of sets into its adult state. which is about 25 or so. And so I thought, okay, well, at least wait till my mid 20s. Well, I got married in my early 20s, had kids in my mid 20s, and that meant I had no time for doing any sort of marathon training, which
Yeah,
is 4 hours on a Saturday. I mean, it's intense. It's a part-time job. It's a
a
part-time
lot.
job. Have you run a marathon, Matt? Are you a runner?
No, my wife ran a couple, and I
Oh, God
barely
bless you.
have
You
much
know it as
use
a
for that and
spouse. Oh
the
my gosh.
recovery. So it's
Yeah, it's
intense.
intense. It's intense. And so I didn't have that extra 15 hours a week to dedicate to running for like 15 years. I mean, from the time I was 24 till I was 39. And finally, when I was 39, 40 was on the horizon. I said, you know what? I'm gonna buckle down. I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna make this happen. And so I did. I got the training program, stuck to it, did what I need to do, and finished my first marathon February of 2020. Yeah, it was
Congrats.
great. It was great. It was a lot of fun. It was in New Orleans, and it was a great accomplishment. And what was awesome about it was that my kids were there. They were old enough, and they could see Dad
Hmm.
cross the finish line. I cried. It's like this thing I had wanted for 20 years to accomplish,
Yeah.
and just for them to still see that, hey, you can still achieve goals no matter how old you are, and to continue to push them forward. And as they become teenagers, I still have to show them from time to time that, hey, I'm still the alpha here.
You
I
can
could
still
still
do
do
things.
things that
Yeah.
are that are here. Um,
Well, that's a good example. It wasn't that you ever gave up on the
yes.
goal. It was something that was there, but trying to think about when does it make sense? And other goals that had higher priority of,
Yep.
taking care of children, that got the priority, but you kept in the back of the mind. It wasn't giving up. It was planning for, you can still do this when it's appropriate and makes sense to do that. And then when that was the case, you pursued it
So
and did
would
it.
you view that waiting, that patience as maybe just part of that pathways, or I guess, or would it fit more into the willpower? Maybe I'm being too technical at this point, but yeah, help me understand where does that fit within these two dimensions that we've been speaking about?
Yeah, I think it's thinking about it's part of the pathways thinking that we have more than one goal that we're pursuing
That's
at
right.
any time.
That's right.
So, we
Yeah.
have, personal,
Yeah.
friendships, family, romantic, all kinds of things that we're doing. And part of what we're doing is juggling, and that there's only so many hours in the day. So, how do you prioritize
Hmm.
your time and how do you work towards what's most essential? And so, you were aware in terms of just, the physical realities of you want to be a certain age for doing a marathon, and then also in the context of having family, like marathons, you can't do it in less than 30 minutes. Like it takes a lot of time to do
Right.
that training. And so you figured out what you needed to do, and then you're aware of, well, this is something I can absolutely do at a later time. And so you had the pathway for pursuing it, and you were just planning it for a later date when it made more sense, given the other goals that you were actively pursuing that were higher priority. And so that's part of it is how do we juggle all of that where it's
Mm.
still something that you're working towards, but you can't do
You
17 things at
can't.
once.
You can't. And time forces you to have to rank your priorities. Um,
Yeah, no one gets
no
to
one, no
escape
one
that.
gets to
So,
escape that. Yeah, no. Where everybody's got the same 24 hours, it doesn't, and that's all we
yep.
get. And it's not something that we can invest and get more of. That despite what our technologies, our advertisers are telling us that is possible,
Hmm.
it's not. And so that then forces questions of priorities, questions of values. Okay, what am I really committing myself to? As we said earlier, questions of reassessing, like, is this working? Is it not working? That's all part of the journey. And I think that's what we want to encourage people with, is to say, like, if you're pursuing something, go for it, pursue it, do it. Like even if the outcome doesn't land exactly where you want it to, there's something to be said about the process of doing something and committing yourself to something. And even if you fail, again, like the process, the adventure, it's all worth it. Like there's things that you're going to learn about yourself, that are going to help you as you continue to move on in life. And so I just want to continue to encourage people in that space, because so often we do put those fears, those uncertainties, those anxieties in the way of us taking the steps forward. And when we break it down and we look at hope and we say, all right, like, no, this is going to help you. It's going to, like, these risks are part of it. Like the obstacles, it's all part of the journey. Like, it's okay. Like, let's go, let's do it. And let's learn something along the way. Well, here we are, Advent, the season of hope. But the season is often not a season of hope or peace, but one of rustle and bustle and getting things done and purchasing and all the other things that we need to do in preparation for Christmas gifts and time with family. But I want to invite you this season to actually take a time to pause and to rest and to let the spirit of the season, which is a season of preparation, a season that invites us to peace, to let that spirit actually take root in your heart and your life. So join me and theologian Dr. Tom Neal as we explore the notions of peace in a 3-part Advent retreat called Let There Be Peace. Head on over to drmariusacasa.com, enroll in the course, and you'll learn and discover new ways of what the church teaches about peace and how to actualize it in your life. What does it mean to actually surrender to the Lord and not just looking at that as resignation? We offer practical suggestions as well, things that you can incorporate today, here and now, that will guide you towards peace. And so join us on this 3-part Advent retreat, Let There Be Peace. Head on over to drmariusacasa.com today to register.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you get too focused on the future and like, well, once I do this and once I do that, then things can be okay, that can be almost paralyzing in terms of that seems so
Right.
far off, where that's part of what hope is trying to do is connect those lofty goals to the here and now so that, yeah, that's where I want to be, but here is the step. And there will be setbacks. Like we don't get everything right the first time we pursue things, but that to maintain that sense of failure is also learning. And so if you were pursuing something and it didn't go well, well, you've learned that that's not the best way to do that. And you can re-goal, readjust your pathways and keep pursuing, or learn that actually I thought what I wanted to do was be a chemistry professor, but I actually want to do physics. And that's not a failure. It's just more insight and development and learning. And that's something
Yeah.
that's valuable.
Or the opposite. Like I've heard from like athletes who achieve a certain goal that sometimes when they achieve that goal, like on the other side of it, life just feels lost. It's like, wow, I ran that marathon under the 3 hours, or wow, I got the Olympic medal, or I hit that goal. And my whole life was singularly focused on achieving that thing. And now I did it. And now what?
Mm-hmm.
What's
What's
next?
next?
Right. But it's almost like this sense of, I achieved the goal and nothing really changed in my life. And I thought I really wanted this thing. And now I've got it. And so I didn't really, but nothing really changed fundamentally in my life after achieving it. So there is something about reiterate like these questions of values or priorities and how we shift through these things. And it's the act of pursuing the goal that I think ultimately helps us to come to terms with all this stuff.
Yeah, and it can be cliche, but trying to enjoy the
Yeah,
journey, and so the process and not just the outcome.
that's right.
I mean, there's wisdom to that.
There's a
So,
lot of wisdom to it, as there is with a lot of cliches. You know, we learned that like they're cliches for a reason, right? You know.
yep.
All right, guys. So much we've been speaking about today has been about goals. Now, I do think that there is a limitation to looking at hope only through the context of goals. I think it's important for us to conceptualize it in goals. I'm a goal-oriented person. I have high goals for myself. I try to achieve them. I can honestly say I have not achieved everything that I've set out that I've wanted to achieve, and I get that, right? But there have been times in my life that I can speak about where I've hit the limits of my capacity, or I've been trying to pursue a goal, and even I've set out all the different pathways, or I just hit the limit of my knowledge base. I've hit the limit of my resources. I've hit the limit of my ability to get out of whatever the mess that I'm in. That could be periods of sickness that I've had in my life, or as a therapist, when I talk to people, I'm accompanying them often through really harsh, difficult moments where people are going through divorce, or people are struggling with depression, or an addiction that they've been dealing with for decades and they can't seem to get on the other side of. That I think we can certainly break things down to micro goals, and maybe that's the answer here, and kind of make things super, super small, which I think is part of this conversation. I think that's important. But I also think that there has to be something deeper though, right? I mean, like hope has to be somehow connected with the notion of meaning. There's got to be something that even if I don't achieve that goal, that there's something that anchors me and anchors my life beyond just my ability to achieve the goals that I have set for myself. And so I almost kind of think of hope in the secondary context, where it's like goals are great and are important, certainly, but there's also needs to be this more anchoring element to hope, that is connected to meaning, and because it's in that place where when we're going through whatever that challenge is, that there's something that we could still hold on to, something that we could still hang our hat on, that says, yeah, like I'm gonna get through this regardless. And I don't really know the way, but somehow, like, there's still good operating within my life, and that knowledge, that it kind of buoys me and still helps me to believe that we can get through whatever the difficulty is. It do you understand what my question is, or does this make sense in terms of like looking at this other notion as well? Or what do you think about this in terms of like, is there a limit to thinking of hope only in goals? And how do we encourage people to look at hope also in this notion of meaning, or purpose, that helps anchor them through whatever difficulty they may be experiencing in their life?
Yeah, I think it's a good question in terms of trying to differentiate, are the goals about achievement or external validation or status, or is the goal tied into what are your personal values and what
Mm-hmm.
provides meaning? And it can
It's a good
be,
question.
particularly in Western culture, in terms of like I'm setting the goals about to achieve this job, to have this car, to live in this place, where it is these external markers that may or may not be as meaningful for you. And so it is important as you reflect on your goals that are they actually consistent with what is most meaningful for you, and trying to think about, and some of that might be not always that you have to dramatically
Mm-hmm.
change things, that if you've achieved what you want in terms of you've got the relationship, the family system that you want, it's not that you always have to be, grass is always greener, you're searching for something different. It can be, the goal can be maintaining and cherishing that. How do you focus on that? And you might need to bring in complementary resources and skills of trying to make sure you're practicing
Mm-hmm.
gratitude, practicing mindfulness. And so, again, hope is important, but it's not the only resilience trait that solves all of our problems. It's one of many things that we think and have found can be important predictors and protectors of mental health and achievement. And so I think tying in meaning is absolutely important, that needs to be part of the reflection, that we can get caught up in school and kind of put on trajectories of you need to do this, to do
Mm-hmm.
this, to do this, next steps. But at some point, if it's not meaningful to you, it's harder to maintain that motivation, that agency, and that persistence when everyone faces setbacks and
Right.
obstacles. And so, how do you stick with it? It's easier if it is intrinsically reinforcing and meaningful.
Well, how do you, I mean, because you do research not only in hope, but you also do research for trauma. Is that right? How do you
Mm-hmm.
combine those two? I mean, when you're talking about somebody who's gone through a horrific circumstance, I mean, like war or sexual violation, or, I mean, something of domestic violence. I mean, just things that we know happen that are just horrific in people's lives. How does hope help somebody through a trauma like that?
It's a good question. We have studied this both in terms of resilience, of how does hope predict levels of post-traumatic stress disorder across different
Mm,
contexts, and also recovery. And we have found that in the aftermath of trauma, that hope can take a hit. It can have an impact in terms of the ability to maintain those positive expectations. Understandably, it's harder in the aftermath of a trauma, whether it's natural disaster, combat, sexual assault,
mm-hmm.
whatever it may be. But that is something that can be a useful resource to, trauma is something that can happen to us. And so it can be an external thing that's happening to us. How do we then recover? And we know most people are incredibly resilient in the
Mm-hmm.
aftermath of trauma, and that there's all kinds of statistics that if you look at the rates of trauma exposure across different populations, there's often estimates that as many as 90% of people will have one or more experiences that would qualify as a traumatic event per our diagnostic system. But if you look at the number of people who actually develop post-traumatic stress
Right.
disorder,
Right.
it's a vastly
Yeah.
lower number. And so it's not to diminish those experiences, but in the aftermath of trauma, the most common outcome is it takes a toll. It's not that it doesn't have an impact, but people are incredibly resilient and they're able to persevere. And sometimes people are able to persevere, they need a little bit of
Hmm.
assistance. And that, whether it's because of safety or ongoing
Hmm.
trauma, we have effective psychotherapies that there is evidence that it's not the only factor, but reinstilling that sense of hope, that belief that I can help to maintain my safety, I can cope with these feelings, that can be one of the valuable steps in terms of a road to recovery, even in the aftermath of trauma.
Tease that out a little bit more. How?
And so, one of the things that happens with trauma is that people can feel like things are uncontrollable and that, there's a natural disaster. We can't wave our hands and make a
Hmm.
hurricane go away. But what can you do in terms of coping? Getting back that sense of what can you do? How can you lean on your neighbors? How can you provide support for others? How can you have that sense of, yes, I can't control the weather, but I can control like what is my response
Hmm.
to it? I can help to support my neighbors. I can kind of do those individual things to have that sense of this happened, and it's not about denying the negative experiences, but how many times has that happened? What are the odds of this happening? To not fall into those negative thinking traps about because this happened once, it's guaranteed to happen
Hmm.
every summer, if in terms of like a natural
Hmm.
disaster. And so these kinds of thinking traps, hope can be an important counter to that in terms of you acknowledge like, yes, it did happen. And there's some things, if the trauma is involving a car accident, maybe there's some things you can do in terms of safe driving. If it's a natural disaster, you can't control if hurricanes come, but what can you do in terms of
Hmm.
coping with things? And so focusing on what is within your control and your resources, and we can't always control the environments, but how we approach, how we appraise, how we think about situations, how we try and cope, it's not easy, but that is something that we
Hmm.
can control.
Are you an ACT guy at all? Do you know about acceptance commitment therapy?
A little bit. I've done some work with that. It's not kind of my
Mm-hmm.
primary orientation, but I think there's a lot of value to that as
Yeah,
well.
me too. Just a little bit. I've started dabbling in it in the last year or so. I'm just doing some CEUs for my license, and man, I've greatly appreciated it, and I see it kind of aligns very cleanly with what we've been speaking about, but just this notion that acceptance is key to this. Acceptance, just acknowledging that, like, where am I in my life? So if somebody's going through, whether it's a traumatic experience or the other things that we've been speaking about throughout this episode, all of us have to come to a point where we just come to some acceptance about where we're at. And then the commitment
Mm-hmm.
element is just to say, all right, well, where is my domain of responsibility? Where do I feel like I have some action? Where do I feel like I have some agency? And if I can at least articulate maybe where one element of that is there, then I can take a step in the direction. Part of acceptance commitment therapy also is doing assessments of our values and trying to assess
Yeah.
what are we really going after. And so I see an overlap with Snyder's theory of hope as well, that is trying to say, okay, there's an element of me in this moment that I have control over, and there's an element of my circumstances that I don't have control over, be it a hurricane or some other a natural disaster or terrible circumstance, which those things are real, and we're not diminishing the emotional element that comes from that.
Yeah.
And some of that is, I
Exactly.
think, grieving is part of it. And I think there's an element that we have to grieve, and that's part of the acceptance piece as well, is to say, all right, that thing didn't come to fruition as I wanted to. The relationship didn't come to happen to the degree that I expected it to happen. The hardship is enduring. To give your heart space to grieve is okay. Like, we're
Mm-hmm.
not robots here, like we want to give space for our hearts to actually emote and do what they need to do. And we want to be able to take a step and say, all right, well, how do I continue to move forward in the direction that I need to move forward in?
Yeah, it's not about being so
Yeah.
Pollyannish or like positive or happy that you're not allowed to experience
Right.
negative emotion. That's part of it. When we have setback, when we have stress, like that is the reality. That's part of life. And you can learn from it and appraise it that that is, you know, temporary and that can be part of what's going on. but it's not falling in the trap of, because this was a negative experience, that everything's going to be negative
Hmm.
going forward. That you can acknowledge it without also
Yeah.
catastrophizing it.
Yeah. Can you have too much hope?
That's been an interesting question, of the idea of kind of false hope, and that's
Uh-huh.
often discussed in the context of, medical
Uh-huh.
circumstances, of coping with, a terrible diagnosis. Is there such a thing as false hope? That's raised as a limitation or criticism of hope
Hmm.
theory. Exactly how that gets quantified or identified, I think, is a tricky thing, in terms of, in an abstract sense, of being so focused on, well, I can cure cancer just by my individual goals, that might be, maybe that would lead you astray. But practically, when we study hope in that context of coping with cancer, we talked about in the aftermath of traumatic experiences, that's not how it often actually plays out. And so, again, it's not that disconnect between everything is perfect or everything is terrible. There's the acknowledgement of the distress, the trauma, the terrible health circumstances, but what are the goals in that
Hmm.
context?
Hmm.
And so there's been people who've worked in hope in the context of palliative
Hmm.
care, where if you have a terminal illness, the goal might not be about what are you planning to do 50 years from now. It's think about, if you're estimated to have 2 or 3 years, what are the goals, and how do you re-goal based on your values and meaning to pursue what you want to the most in that time frame? And that it's not about that sense of denial. And I think that's what's often implied with false hope, is that there's a disconnect with reality and circumstances, um, which is worth considering and
Hmm.
studying. But I think it's more of an abstract idea than something that there's a tremendous amount of empirical support in terms of, when people have hope, how they actually cope
Got
with
it.
things.
Got it. Yeah, because when I think of the false hope and the scenarios you're speaking of, I have two examples that kind of came to my mind. One is Steve Jobs, who I didn't know personally, obviously. Like I don't know Steve Jobs, but what I've read about Steve Jobs and is that when he was diagnosed with cancer, he went immediately to teas and more herbal route and more natural route,
Yeah.
rather than getting on the traditional Western route of chemotherapies, radiation, and that type of stuff. In that, when he finally shifted gears to move into that direction, it was too late. That the cancer had already spread too far. I think that's right. Somebody can fact check me on that, but that's kind of how I've heard the story. And so maybe there's a notion of a false hope there, in that he put his hope on the more herbal route, um, but what he really needed was something different, to be able to actually bring the cure to the cancer. Now, whether it would have cured him or not, I don't know. Obviously, like I'm not a doctor and I don't know any specifics of the situation, but at least anecdotally, that's the story that's been told. So there's that. But then another example that I give, and I share this often, is a friend of mine who lost his wife to breast cancer. She fought hard for 6 years, and the two of them as a couple were just tremendous. I mean, just I mean, heroes throughout the whole thing. And I talked to Jason about Elise's diagnosis and what they're doing, and he said, "Listen, we have a checklist, and it's this long, and the doctor has said these are the steps we're going to go through, and until they say there's nothing left to do, like we won't, then we'll just continue to be focused on what the next step is." Well, at some point, it became
Mm-hmm.
clear that they were running out of options, and that the cancer
Yeah.
had taken over, and so they just made the best of this. I mean, she raised funds for other folks who had cancer to create support care packages. She was very public with her story and tried to give people hope through her message, that even when you're dying and when you're struggling, that you can still have a healthy disposition, that you can still be faithful, you can still do what you can in terms of being a good mother, you can still serve others. So they were I mean, they were very, very open with their story. That at her funeral, I mean, there was, I don't even know how many people, thousands of people came to the viewing. It was just
Mm-hmm.
unbelievable to see what they did with the circumstances that befell them. And I look at her and them together, and I would say there wasn't a false hope there, that they
No.
made the right transition, to look at this from this context of meaning. Like we've said, and that they anchored their experience in something more. And then even Jason now, Elise has it's been 5 years now since her passing. I mean, he's raising the kids and he's telling her story, and he's still finding meaning even in the journey as it's coming to him. Um, so I just think those stories are heroic, in my estimation, and something that I think we need to hold on to when it comes to hope.
Yeah, and I think that's what hope is about in many ways, is it's trying to make the best of what's
Mm,
possible. And none of
mm,
us has a magical ability to live forever. Like we can't fly, like we can't do certain things, but with the time that we have and we don't know how long that's going to be, how do we try to make the best of that in terms of what's most important to us and the values and the goals that we have? And so I think that's part of it in terms of just because you have high hope doesn't mean, okay, that means I'm going to be protected for
mhm,
cancer or any kind of bad things. Like that's not how life works. Is things happen and we
mhm,
persevere. And so how do you keep coping? How do you keep focusing on doing what's best and working towards the goals that you have and persevering when inevitably
mhm.
things happen? And so I think that's part of it, is that it's not a denial that life can be stressful and traumatic. It's that that's the case and we have to keep living. So what do we do?
Is there any research that supports, or maybe not supports, but just has some articulation of hope in the context of like spirituality or religious practice or faith or anything in that notion?
Yeah, there have been some studies that have looked at that and that
Hmm.
intersection, and that's something that can be something that for some individuals is like a really important buffer kind of resource to support their hope. I think some people faith is an incredibly important
Hmm.
part of their lives, and that could be something that is a valuable part of that. Again, whether that gets into the hope versus optimism of there's different views on faith and different
Right.
religious traditions in terms of how much are you actively pursuing things, or are you just trusting an external power to
Right.
support you, and not getting into the right wrong
Right.
of that,
That's
but
right.
how those might align to hope or optimism in different ways. um, but that is something that for many people, yeah, maybe their faith is an important foundation for a sense
Hmm.
of hope. For some, it's their
Hmm.
family. For some, it's their kids. For some, it's just their own personal
Hmm.
experiences. And I think it's finding the agents that kind of help to support you in pursuing those goals and having that hope, whatever that may be. That's
Yeah.
what's important.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for answering that question. Um,
Mm-hmm.
all right. So if somebody's listening to this episode and they're fascinated by this, but maybe they're in a situation where they're really low hope right now. Maybe they've been pursuing a dream for a while, but they're struggling with motivation to keep going, or maybe it's the pathways thinking that they're struggling with. They can't seem to get the answers. They're still desiring, but they can't. Just frustrated by the reality of the circumstances. I mean, what advice, what wisdom, what can you say to somebody in a situation like that to help them continue to pursue and hope?
Yeah, that's something that can come up when we're working with people who are suffering from depression. There can be that sense of hopelessness or learned helplessness where people become disconnected from a belief that they can do anything that actually affects change, and that they've had setbacks and experiences that make it really hard to maintain that faith that you can actually affect change. And so sometimes when we're working with clients that are depressed, there's some strategies that are more cognitive, but other things of a strategy called behavioral activation, where simply just getting out and doing things and just starting to, okay, you might not feel like going for a walk, but just doing some simple things to see, well, how do I start taking steps to make things happen, rather than getting so stuck in my head about how things are so terrible or so helpless or so hopeless. That it can be something of just starting to schedule activities. And if you're feeling alone, just, okay, well, let's go places and let's try to meet people. And this is something in the aftermath of COVID changed for a lot of people in terms of the
Hmm.
isolation, but just scheduling activities, becoming physically active, some of these kinds of tasks, it can be starting with those concrete steps to, again, you're trying to get that momentum. And so if you're feeling really depressed or down, even the smallest thing can seem overwhelming. And so going back to your example, you don't start with running the marathon, you start with running a couple
Right.
hundred yards, and then you build your way up to that. And so trying to think about reflecting back on your values, what is meaningful, what are the things that you need to or want to reestablish, and what's that first step. And once you achieve that first step and you have that mastery experience, that second step that seems so much harder will seem a little bit easier after you had some success under your belt. And that's a lot of what we've learned in studying hope, optimism, self-efficacy, these kinds of concepts. It's having those mastery experiences, having encouragement from others, having role models or examples of people that have gone through these things. Like all of these can help us in that moment have that motivation to persevere, because so much of this is easier
Oh
said than
yeah.
done.
Yeah.
And it is also
Hmm.
still doable. And so it's acknowledging that combination, that it's much easier to preach this and to practice it, but also it's doable.
Are you a David Goggins fan at all? Have you listened to any of his material or work? Do you know who I'm
I've
talking
not,
about at all? Do you have
no,
any
I'm
idea? No.
not,
Okay, so
not
he's
familiar now.
he's like a popular, I guess, influencer. I hate that word, but I guess that'd be the word to use. He's this Navy SEAL turned fitness guy. But his whole
Mm,
story is that he weighed 300 pounds and just one day decided to do something about it and started losing the weight. And but in his upbringing is horrendous. He shares about it in his book "Can't Hurt Me," about just intense abuse that he experienced on the hands of his father. Just the situation's horrific, racism, the whole bit. But his message really is summed up in just like a harsh, no excuse mentality, that at times can be a little extreme, and I admit that. But there's sometimes there's an element, there's a truth in it that depression, for example, can be very convincing, and the negative thoughts that we experience in the story that we start telling ourselves can be very convincing that it is in fact true, when it may not be. And so somebody like Goggins, who's super intense and just takes a no excuses mindset. It's like just get up and go. Like just do it. He embodies that Nike message, I think, more than anybody else. And but he'll
mm,
tell you like running. I mean, he's run like 250-mile races, but he has this extreme kind of athletic capacity, which I know isn't a one-to-one. I know it's hard to look at athletic achievement and transpose that cleanly into life, because
yeah,
there's a lot more variables when it comes to life. Like athletics it's easy to determine success, because because you can, right? um,
yeah,
there's a
score.
score. Exactly. Yeah, life doesn't have a score. So I know it's not exactly the same, but there's still something to be said about just like that motivation, again, needing that from some people, just to be able to look at it and say, all right, like if this guy can do it, I can do it. And so I would say to people who are struggling with hope, to surround yourself with stories that are encouraging you. I know we might have the temptation to want to listen to our dashboard confessionals in a emo phase. I just dated myself there, but and get real sad with our music. But like sometimes that can actually have an opposite effect on us, where it just continues to pull us down. Where what you probably need is something that's going to lift you up a little bit. So find the stories, find the movies, find the folks online who can give you a little bit of a shot in the arm, because you might not be able to get that. Now, of course, obviously, open yourself up to your family, to your friends, to your community. Avail yourself to the resources that are around you. But even still, sometimes we just need to surround ourselves with good stories, because those stories are going to help us. Um, Thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's finding the messaging that
Hmm.
resonates with you. I think some people, some of those like, boot camp kind
Yep.
of mantras, if that's what works for you. Others, if it's more of a spiritual
Hmm.
component, I think in some ways it doesn't matter what it is, just finding that fit, and that people have different kind of values and styles and feelings and kind of what resonates for you. And yeah, I think that first step is the hardest. And so trying to figure out what's going to help you get off the couch, so to speak, and do what you need to do. And some of that can also involve uh, some self
Hmm.
compassion.
Hmm.
And so as you're working on trying to think about things you want to change, not falling into the trap. And this is what we see sometimes working with folks suffering from depression is like, well, yeah, that's possible for other people. But when people are having sense like, so worthless, I can't do this, not falling into that trap of, well, because you haven't done this yet, that means you're a failure, you're bad. And so trying to counteract that thoughts is that you still have an opportunity, you can work towards these things, and that not falling into those thinking traps is easier said than done. It's
It
valuable.
is easier said than done. So part of that again is just paying attention to your thinking, and using the ACT
Yeah.
model also it'll ask this question of what's helpful and what's not helpful. And sometimes the thinking
Mm-hmm.
that we have is just not helpful, and so we can let it go. It's not about being right or wrong. It's just like what genuinely is going to be helpful or not, and whatever's not helpful, let it go, and keep going. And surround yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I said, family member stories. One of my go-tos, one of my favorite movies of all time is Spider-Man 2. You a Spider-Man fan, Matt, or am I alone I'm alone here. I know it's an older movie. So
I've seen it. I don't recall which one that was though.
that's the one when he fights Doc Ock the first time. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And
Yes.
so there's a great line where he's kind of down in the dumps a little bit, and he goes to his aunt's house, and she's cleaning up, and she's moving because she can't afford the house that she's in anymore, but she's accepted it, and she's like, all right, it's no big deal, like we'll just move on. But she has this great line where she's talking about Spider-Man, not knowing that Peter Parker's Spider-Man. And she says, what does he do? What is it? Is his I think there's a hero inside all of us, she says, that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us brave. That this notion that we need these heroes in life, because
Mm-hmm.
they help orient us and help keep our minds focused on what's possible, and get us out of ourselves. And so hope is that virtue. I reiterate this to folks. Hope is that virtue that helps us to get out of ourselves. It's that trait, it's that capacity within us to say, yeah, life's hard. Yes, I'm going through stuff. Yes, I'm struggling right now. And that's not even to say it's okay. But it is. It's real. It's legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
It's reality.
Reality.
And what? And what? And what?
Yeah. And how do you keep living? How do you keep pursuing goals? And how do you keep working toward the future
Mm-hmm.
that you want? And so that's, I think, the trick is working towards that. And there'll be setbacks, and that's when you can learn and grow from that, and persevere. And I think, again, like we've been talking about, it's not that it solves everything for you. And there's other times where, being grateful, having
Mm-hmm.
curiosity, mindfulness, there's lots
Mm-hmm.
of other resources and resilience traits. But we do know from decades of work now that ability to have that sense of hope, it can be powerful in many
Yeah.
contexts.
All right. Well, wonderful. I think that's where we're land this thing. So Matt, thanks so much for joining me again on the podcast.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you for
keep
having
up
me
the great work
again.
you're doing and all the research that you're offering. Really important stuff to help people.